Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created with Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on updating our world seed to have a dialogue component that is used for rendering out the text from our signs in our game. If you missed the previous videos, we have links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so now that we have our logic in place for displaying our dialogue component when the user interacts with one of our signs, what we're going to do next is we're going to work on adding our NPCs to our game. And so what we're going to end up doing is we're going to go ahead and load our object layers tied to our NPC, so similar to what we did for our signs. And then we're going to use that metadata to go ahead and create NPC game objects and place them in our game. And then we're going to work on updating those NPCs to be able to move around our world and to have dialogue to talk to our player. So to get started, the first thing we want to do is we actually need to create a class for our NPC. And so what we're going to end up doing is we're going to go ahead and extend our character class that we initially created for our player. And we're going to go ahead and create an NPC version. And so what we'll do is under our world characters folder, let's go ahead and add a new file. And we're going to do npc.js. Let's go ahead and export out our class. And we're just going to call this NPC. We're going to extend our character class. And then what we'll do is let's add our constructor, and for our constructor, we're going to need our config, and then what we'll do is we'll do super, and we'll go ahead and pass in our config. So what we're going to do is let's jump over to our player class, and we're going to go ahead and copy some of our logic here. And so what we're going to do is let's go ahead and copy our type here for our player config, and we'll do a similar one for our NPC config. And so for our NPC config, what we'll want to do is we're going to ignore our asset key, our idle frame config, and what we'll want to do is we're going to want to actually add a few properties. And so after we omit the fields that we don't need, what we're going to do is we're going to add the and sign, and we're going to go ahead and add an property called frame, and this is going to be a number. And then for our type, what we're going to do is we'll call this NPC config. And so what we're doing here is originally when we export our data from tiled, one of the things we did is on our JSON file for our NPCs, we added a property for our frame. And that initial frame is going to refer to our images and our character spreadsheet that we're loading for our NPCs. And the frame is going to refer to the main idle frame for that NPC. And so when we create an instance of our NPC class, we need to pass that frame forward. So versus we're in our player class, we went ahead and had those hard-coded because our player sprite asset wouldn't be changing. All right, so now that we have our NPC config, what we can go ahead and do is we can go ahead and update our parameter to be our NPC. So let's go ahead and come above our constructor, and we'll go ahead and change this to NPC config. And then what we'll have to do is we'll have to update our super call as well. So in our super method, let's go ahead and just paste that. And for our asset key, we want to go ahead and import our character asset keys. And we want to change this to NPC. Then for our origin, what we'll do is we're just going to go ahead and do 0, 0. And for our idle frame config, what we'll want to do is for our down, this is going to be our config.frame that's provided. This will be the same thing if none's not provided. And then what we need to do for our other keys is we jump back over to our sprite sheet real quick. So if we pass in 0 for this NPC here, and so if our NPC is facing up, we just want to add 1 to it. And so this is the same for all of our NPCs here. So what we can do is for the up, we can do config.frame, and we'll add 1 to it. Then for our left and right, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to use this sprite here, this frame. And so if we need to face to the left, what we'll do is we'll flip it, but we're going to use that same frame here. And so what we'll do is let's just copy this code here. We're going to paste that, and we'll change this to 2, and then we'll go ahead and save. All right, and the last thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and actually scale up our game objects. So our character sprite sheet here is a lot smaller than our player. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference our phaser game object that's protected, and we're going to do set scale, and let's go ahead and set this to 4. All right, so now that we have our base NPC class, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create some instances of our NPC. So we can jump over to our world scene. The first thing we'll do is at the top of our class, let's add a new property, and we're going to call this NPCs. And for the type, this is just going to be an array of our NPC instances. So we'll go ahead and do NPC, and let's make that an array. And then what we'll do is let's come down to our create method, and we'll go ahead and create our NPCs. So what we're going to go ahead and do is before we create our player, let's go ahead and create our NPCs. So we'll just add a comment. We'll do create NPCs, and let's go ahead and do this in a new method. So we'll do this, create NPCs, and let's go ahead and pass in our map. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and come down to the bottom of our class, and let's define this private method, and we'll take map for our parameter. And so what we're doing here is for our NPCs, we know we need to go ahead and get our object layer that's tied to our NPCs. However, there's going to be multiple layers. So when we set up our code, so when we went ahead and set up our tiled project, what we did is we had a folder for NPCs, and we made a separate layer for each of our NPCs. And then that way we could add all the metadata for each of our NPCs and make it easy to modify that data while we're working with it. And so what we're going to need to do is grab all of those layers, and for each one of them, we'll want to go ahead and create that NPC and grab the relevant metadata to create our instance. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is in this method, the first thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and set our NPCs to be equal to an empty array. And then real quick, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add in our JS.comments for our parameters and our types. All right, then that way we'll have our IntelliSense while we're working. So the first thing we need to do is let's go ahead and get our layers. And so what we'll do is we'll make a new variable. We're just going to call this NPC layers. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference our map parameter. And we're going to use the get object layer names method. And so this is going to go ahead and return an array of strings, and these are going to be all of the object group layer names from our tile JSON file from our map. And because this is an array, we're going to go ahead and filter our data. And we're going to go ahead and filter our layer names to only include layers that have our NPC inside the string. So what we'll do is we'll have layer name, and what we'll do is in our check, we're just going to go ahead and return layer name includes our substring. So the string we want to search for, it'll be NPC. So for each of our layers, we had it like NPC1, NPC2. And so by doing this, we'll get all those layers back. And then once we have our layers, we're going to need to go ahead and iterate through each of them to create our NPCs. So what we'll do is we'll do our NPCs layer. We'll go ahead and use the for each method. And now we will have our layer name. And then for our layer name, what we need to do is go ahead and grab that layer from our map. So we'll do const layer is going to equal our map, and we'll do get object layer, and we can go ahead and provide the name of our layer, and so that'll be our layer name. And now that we have our layer, we want to go ahead and get our NPC object. So what we'll do is we'll make a new variable. We'll do const NPC object. We're going to set this equal to our layer. We want to reference the objects array. And then we need to go ahead and find our object that is tied to our NPC. So if you remember on our layer, we have one object that's tied to the NPC, and then we have a bunch of objects that are tied to the path that the NPC can walk on if it's one that moves around. And so while we are trying to find this object, what we're going to go ahead and do is return our object type is going to be equal to NPC. And so what this should do is this should return back our single tiled object that is of the type NPC. All right, and so what we're doing here is in tiled, when we added our objects, for our objects, we were able to provide them a name and a type. And the type is the custom class that we added to our objects. And so we added NPC and then also our NPC path. And so what we're going to do real quick is let's just go ahead and console log out our layer.objects. And if we go ahead and save, we jump back over to scene, what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and take a look at some of our data. And so right now, when we get both of our layers, we are logging both of the objects tied to those layers out. And so for our first one, this is our NPC that we set up to move around our game. And so what it has is it has 8 different objects on it. Only one of them has the name NPC, and then the rest of these have the name of the path where we want the NPC to move around. Versus our other NPC, this one's an idle NPC, and so we can see the name is NPC, and our type, that's what we're really looking for, is type of NPC. All right, then, so what should happen is after we do the find method, this return our object that is of the type NPC. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to add a safety check just in case if our NPC object was not found, or if our NPC object is missing some of the metadata we need, like an X position, so if it equals undefined, or if it's missing the Y position, then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to go ahead and return early. And this is just a safety check, so then that way, if we don't have the data we need, we're not going to bother adding that NPC to our game. And then later on, what we could do is we could enhance our code to actually validate our JSON file before we use it. And likely this could be part of like our deployment process to make sure we don't deploy out a game with invalid JSON data. All right, so then if we do have our NPC object, now we need to go ahead and create our NPC instance. And so what we'll do is we'll do const NPC, we'll say equal to new NPC. And so for our config, we need to go ahead and pass our phaser scene. So we'll reference this. Then we need our position. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and pass in our X property. And so we'll do NPC object, and we will do X. And then for our Y, we're going to do our NPC object.Y. And then we'll subtract our tile size. So similar to what we did for our sign, because of how that object is added to the scene, we need to make sure we have the right value here. And then we need to go ahead and do our direction. So we'll do direction, and we're just going to hard code this to direction.down when we add in our initial NPC. And then we need to go ahead and add in our frame. And so for our frame, what we need to do is we need to grab our properties from our object. So here on our one NPC, we'll see we have our properties array. And so these are going to be our 3 objects. And so it's going to have our frame, the messages to the character, and then what type of movement pattern it is. And so what we need to do is we need to grab and find the object that has the name frame. And so what we'll do is above our NPC, let's go ahead and make a new variable, do NPC frame. And we're going to set that equal to our NPC object. And we will do our properties. And we're going to use the find method. And then so for our properties, what we really want to do is we'll have our property. And we want to return the object that has the property.name equal to frame. And if we do find this, we'll go ahead and return the value. Otherwise, let's just go ahead and add a default value of 0, and then that will be our fallback. So then what we can do is with our frame, we can now pass that here for our NPC frame. Oh, and one last thing what we'll want to do is for our frame, it's coming in as a string. We actually need to go ahead and pass in our number. So we're going to go ahead and do parse int, and we'll do our NPC frame. And then for our fallback, all right, we do have it as a string, perfect. So then once we have our NPC, we just need to go ahead and add that to our array. That way we can keep track of that object. We'll do this NPCs, and we'll do push, and let's add in our NPC. All right, so go ahead and save. What we should see right away is we should see one of our NPCs added in front of our building here. And if we come down, we should see another NPC for our other character here. All right, so since we validated our logic's working, what we're going to do is just do a quick refactor on some of our properties that we're using from tiled. And so for our NPC characters, the data we have in tiled, we're going to have a few different values. The first one's going to be tied to our objects. We have our type of NPC, and then we'll have our type of NPC path. Instead of doing our strings like this hard-coded here, we're just going to abstract this out to an object. And then that way we can just update this in one location, and then that way throughout our code, we'll just have that object we can use. It'll just make it a little bit easier if we ever need to add more types. We'll just have all this in one central location. So what we'll do for the time being is we come to the top of our file. All right, so what we'll do is let's go ahead and just copy this here. Let's go ahead and paste it. And for our variable, let's call this custom tile types. And so for our types, we're going to have NPC and NPC. Let's copy this, and we'll go ahead and paste it. And we'll have our NPC path and NPC path. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do another object for our properties that exist on our object. So we'll copy this here. And so for our variable, we'll do tiled NPC property. And what we had on our NPC is we had messages. So we had a string called messages. For the dialog, we'll show to the player. We are going to have a variable called is spawn point. We'll do is spawn point. And then we had movement pattern. And so that was movement pattern. And then finally we had frame. We'll set that to frame. All right, then what we can do is with our new objects, let's jump back down to our code. And so instead of doing frame, what we're going to go ahead and do is we'll do our tiled NPC property and we'll do frame. And then likewise for our NPC, let's go ahead and do our custom tiled types and we'll have NPC. All right, so one last thing we need to do for NPCs is we actually need to call the update method. So what we're going to do is let's jump to our update method in our world scene. And after we call the update method on our player, let's go ahead and for each of our NPCs, we'll want to go ahead and call that method. So we'll do this, our NPCs, and we'll do update this NPCs, and we'll do for each. And then for each of our NPCs, what we'll want to do is we're just going to call npc.update, and we'll pass in time. And so for right now, it's not going to do anything to our NPCs, but it sets us up for later for once our NPCs need to start moving around. All right, so with our refactor done real quick, what we're going to do is we'll jump back to our NPC class. And so the next thing we need to do for our NPCs, we need to add in support for the dialogue and for moving our NPCs around if they're not idle. And part of this is when our player talks to our NPCs, we'll also need to have our NPC face our player. And then that way we can set the appropriate frame to face the player. And so to get started on that logic, what we'll do is in our NPC class, we'll go ahead and make a new method, and we're going to add in our logic for facing the player first. And so what we'll do is we'll make a new public method. Let's scroll down, and we'll do face player. And so when we face our player, we need to know the direction of the player. So this will be our only parameter. And then so based on the direction the player is, we can use the other direction to have our NPC face towards them. So let's go ahead and add our switch statement. We'll do our player direction, and real quick, we're going to go ahead and add in our JSON type. So we'll have our IntelliSense. And so for player direction, this is just going to be the type direction, and then our method won't actually return anything. And then so what we can do is we'll add in our case statement. So we'll have direction down. And let's go ahead and add in our break statement. Let's go ahead and copy this. We'll paste it a few times. And so we will have left, right, and up. Then we'll have direction none. And we will do break. And then finally we'll add in our default. And let's go ahead and add in our exhaustive guard. And we'll pass in our player direction. All right, so then what we want to do is basically update our phaser game object and use the set frame method to set our frame. So if the player is facing down, then we want to go ahead and reference our phaser game object. We'll call set frame. And what we'll want to do is reference our idle frame. So our idle frame config here, we just want to go ahead and reference the up property. So then that way our NPC will face up. So we'll do this, our idle frame config, and we will get the up property. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to also set the set flip x property. And so the reason for this is because our NPC only has one frame for both left and right, and we just need to set this appropriately. And so we'll do set flip x, and we're going to set this to false. So then what we can do is let's copy this line, and we're going to paste that for each of our various cases. Except for direction none, we won't do anything. So then when the player is facing left, we should go ahead and face right with our NPC. We'll go ahead and have false, and then right, we're going to want left. And then here, we need to go ahead and flip our frame, so then that way we're facing the appropriate direction. And then finally, direction up, we need to go ahead and have our NPC face down. Alright, with that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to continue working on our NPC class. And we're going to focus on collisions with both our NPCs and the player and the NPCs. And so what we're going to do is we're going to enhance our player logic to take in our NPC game objects and then make sure we cannot collide with them. And then likewise with our NPCs, when they're moving around, we'll want to make sure our NPCs don't collide with our player if they need to move to the next spot. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.